Once again, the road in this content starts at Street Fighter 2, the game that is credited for rejuvenating the arcade market, in a period where people spent the majority of their gaming time at home. With Street Fighter 2's success, Capcom decided that they wanted to milk the game for all it was worth, which would soon lead to the countless revisions of the game, with each iteration receiving slightly more polish than the next. Despite relying on this formula for at least a few years, Capcom knew that in order to captivate the Street Fighter audience, sooner or later the fans would need something new, which would eventually lead to the arcade release of Street Fighter Alpha in Japan in December of 1995. For reasons, this was simply not enough for Capcom, as over the next 12 months, following the release of the game, the arcades would bloody see the release of another 4 fighting games featuring the name Street Fighter in the title. 1996 was a particularly busy year for the franchise, as it would see the debut of Street Fighter Alpha 2, Street Fighter 3, Street Fighter EX, and the subject of today's video, Xmen vs Street Fighter. That is a bloody lot of Street Fighter for one single year, eh? Which makes it no surprise at all that the casual audience severely struggled to keep up and stay interested in the regular Street Fighter brand past this point. Anyway, out of the games that were released this year, the most interesting out of that bunch for me personally in the 90s was Xmen vs Street Fighter. Now before we talk about this title itself in more depth, let us talk about the second franchise that was part of this game, Xmen, and where it stood historically in 1996. Obviously, Xmen originally debuted in 1963 in the form of a comic book series written by Stan Lee. By the time we got to the 90s, the franchise had entered into other entertainment mediums. On February 12, 1992, the day of my 6th birthday, an X-Men beat-em-up was released into the arcade by Konami. Apparently, the character designs in this game would be based on the 1989 X-Men cartoon pilot episode known as Pride of the X-Men, and this simple repetitive game is remembered extremely fondly today. Later that year, X-Men the animated series would debut on the Fox Kids network, and would become both critically acclaimed and a huge commercial success. As a result, this would spawn another 4 seasons of the show, as well as leading to a comic book spin-off of the comic book spin-off, as well as other merchandise such as action figures and of course video games. Amongst all of this, Capcom would manage to strike up a licensing deal with Marvel, and as a result would release a fighting game in 1994 titled X-Men Children of the Atom. The game was originally released in the arcades on the Capcom CP System 2 hardware, before being released on a number of home platforms. The fighting game features controls and conventions Capcom previously established within the Street Fighter 2 games, and the original Darkstalkers. This game is particularly important in today's story, as part of a licensing agreement struck by Capcom allowed them to place Akuma as a secret character in the game, interestingly making this the first game in which characters from X-Men and Street Fighter would face off against each other. The following year of 1995, it would see the next Capcom Marvel game, simply titled Marvel Superheroes, which would be a similar fighting game, only this time featuring a whole range of characters from across the Marvel universe, as opposed to just X-Men, like in Children of the Atom. What makes this game particularly interesting today is that the story of the game is based on the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, making this game more culturally relevant than on release. As a result, the game includes the feature of collecting Infinity Gems from your opponents, as well as a final encounter against Thanos. So yeah, with all this info in mind, and Capcom releasing a series of both Marvel and Street Fighter games year in year out, it would make sense that by 1996 they could cross the 2 universes together. The game's opening scene touts itself as the wildest crossover you have never dreamt, which I guess would be completely applicable if you never saw Akuma in Children of the Atom 2 years prior. Anyway, within this game on Capcom CP System 2 hardware, the player select screen gives you a choice of 16 playable characters, 8 of which come from the world of X-Men and the others from Street Fighter. I want to take a quick moment to talk about the selection of Street Fighter characters we are presented with. 7 are straight from Street Fighter 2, which makes a lot of sense considering how popular the game was. But for some reason, the final Street Fighter on the menu select is Charlie from Street Fighter Alpha for some reason, a character who is, according to in-game lore, a friend and mentor to Guile. Which leads me to the question as to why they did not just include Guile in the first place, considering no one from the mainstream is going to have a bloody clue who Charlie is anyway. Well, to answer this question, the answer is quite simple. All of the Street Fighter sprites in the game have simply been used straight from Street Fighter Alpha 2, and unfortunately Guile was not included in Alpha 2, so I guess Capcom never fancied the work of creating him from scratch for this game. In fact, it was not only the Street Fighter character sprites that were ripped straight from another game, most of the Xmen character sprites were ported straight out of Children of the Atom, so therefore the majority of animations in the game were simply recycled from other games. The only completely freshly drawn playable characters for this title are Rogue, Sabrewulf and Gambit, since they never featured in any Capcom games previously, so at least that is something I suppose. Once again, in regards to the characters, Akuma once again also makes an appearance as a secret character within the game, which is a fun little trope that Capcom seemed to be really stretching over a lot of different titles from the period. On top of everyone else we have talked about, the game features a final boss battle against Apocalypse, which is a nice change of pace from many Capcom fighters of the time, bearing in mind that he is not a regular fighter and takes up the majority of the screen, like a final boss encounter in a Mega Man game or something. Anyway, like Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter Alpha and Capcom's previous Marvel games, this one is obviously yet another 2D fighting game, and as a result consists of the player controlling characters in one-on-one combat. Who would have thought? This game varies though from all of its predecessors in that it features dual character selection and tag team matches, players. The game further differs from many fighters in that the best of 3 rounds format is completely ditched, and instead the fighting in this entry consists of just single rounds. Going back to that lovely player select screen I mentioned earlier, the player must actually select 2 of these players prior to a playthrough, and as a result the starting character can tag in and out of the fight with their off-screen character at will. In regards to this mechanic, both controllable characters sport their own independent life gauges, and the dormant off-screen character will even regenerate HP when not in battle. If one of your characters is knocked out, then the other jumps straight into play, letting the match continue until a team is defeated. All in all, making this Teddy Long's all-time favourite fighting game. Holla holla holla! Other game mechanics are ported over from the previous Capcom Marvel games, including the Super Jump, which lets characters jump higher than normal, and the Aerial Rave, which lets you do a combo whilst up in the air. In regards to some of the big moves in this game, many are quite frankly ridiculous, and to be honest, very fitting of the Xmen. When it comes to the Street Fighters on the other hand, certain manoeuvres look a bit out of place. For example, Ryu can all of a sudden perform a massive Kamehameha beam, as opposed to just a simple Hadouken. This special attack is imaginatively named the Super Hadouken. Very creative, eh? As mentioned earlier in the video, this game would hit the arcades in Japan in late 1996 and would shortly go into circulation around the world shortly after. According to Electronic Gaming Monthly, the game was only mildly popular when first released on US soil, but after a few months began to pick up some steam after people began to realise this cool game existed. From personal experience back home in the UK, I too have memories of stumbling across this game on an arcade unit somewhere and being blown away that I could play Street Fighter and Xmen in the same damn game. In terms of how journalists responded to this game at the time, opinions were mixed, with the main consensus being that the game was a decent fighter but just one of many to exist at the time. Next Generation, for example, praised the new tag team mechanic, along with the inflated projectile attacks and lengthy combos. However, they took note of how much Capcom were milking the fighting game formula, so concluded, X-Men vs Street Fighter is a fun game, but it's just a bit of an overdose of the kind of game of which we've already played way too much. On the whole, from what I can tell from my personal observations, the arcade version of this game seems to be quite fondly remembered. For me and many, I guess the main drawing factor was simply the novelty to have Street Fighter and Xmen characters in the same bloody game. This was one of the coolest things ever to see as a child who enjoyed both franchises, especially when you take into account that this was in an era where corporate crossovers seemed to happen a lot more infrequently. As we know, Super Smash Bros. Did not even exist at this point in time yet. Touching back on this game's gameplay, from what I could learn, each character in the game had at least one infinite combo, which apparently was not intentional and was only left in the game due to insufficient beta testing. As a result, Capcom would quietly tinker with the game, resulting in two updated versions of the game, colloquially known as version 2 and version 3. The main change in version 2 of the game is that it removed Ryu and Akuma's abilities to recover from their hop kicks in midair. Version 2 also changed Ryu's Hurricane super move to move the player up as opposed to down like in the original version. Finally, Sabretooth and Dhalsim's mechanics were also tinkered with. Version 3 of the game would see a bigger overhaul, which would result in Capcom removing all of the infinite combos in which they knew of. In last week's video, I mentioned that it took 3 years to get Street Fighter 3 over to a home console due to the game being too technologically developed to be able to run on any game console of the period. The characters featured too many animation frames and as a result would only run on the Capcom CP System 3 hardware. Thankfully for Capcom, Xmen vs Street Fighter was a little less taxing, ran off CP System 2 hardware and featured many assets that were simply recycled from Children of the Atom and Street Fighter Alpha 2, two games that had already been wonderfully ported to the Sega Saturn. As a result, at a November 6, 1996 press conference, Capcom announced that the home version of Xmen vs Street Fighter would be an exclusive to the Sega Saturn. This would lead to the press and fans of the franchise accusing Capcom of favouritising Sega, which was bolstered by the fact that Darkstalkers Revenge was also a Saturn exclusive and that Street Fighter Alpha 2 did not run as well on the PlayStation as it did on the Sega Saturn. In reality though, Street Fighter Alpha 2 running better on the Saturn, and making the decision to make Xmen vs Street Fighter a Saturn home exclusive, had nothing to do with favouritism and simply related to the Sega Saturn's 2D capabilities. The Saturn was a superior system to the PlayStation in that regard, as it offered 50% more video memory, which in turn meant that the system could produce bigger, better sprites and offer superior backgrounds. The Saturn's two video processors could handle 2D beautifully, and that is before we even get into the introduction of Saturn RAM cartridges. So all in all, the decision to make the game a Saturn exclusive seemed like a very sensible choice. Sadly though, before the game was released, popularity of the Sega Saturn in the West continued to diminish, in favour of the Sony Playstation superior marketing, cheaper price point and heavy emphasis on polygon gaming. Taking this into account, along with the pressure from the Western Capcom fanbase, the decision to make Xmen vs Street Fighter a Sega Saturn exclusive was soon completely rescinded. Electronic Gaming Monthly reported that Capcom stated that instead of making the game a Sega exclusive, the game would have PlayStation and Saturn versions of Xmen vs Street Fighter that would now be released simultaneously and would both be arcade perfect. 14 months after the game's arcade release, Xmen vs Street Fighter would arrive on the Saturn in November of 1997, exclusively in Japan, with the PlayStation version of the game being nowhere to be seen. The game would be released to rave reviews and see a critical response that was even stronger than with the original arcade release. This conversion of the game would be heavily praised for its fast-paced gameplay, great animation, sound quality and technical performance in comparison to its arcade counterpart. GameSpot were in love with the game and stated that there is no better looking 2D fighter on any console system. Game Informer added to the praise of the port for running and looking identical to its arcade counterpart and declaring it one of the best arcade conversions ever seen to date. Next Generation 2 with regards to this version stated that if nothing else, Xmen vs Street Fighter proves the old adage, more is better. The game ran pretty much arcade perfect on Saturn hardware, which was made possible due to the system's 2D capabilities, paired with the adage of the Capcom 4MB RAM cartridge that came with the game. The Capcom Cartridge was a system expansion cart that preceded the 1MB RAM cartridge that had been released by SNK at an earlier date for the system. This extra memory would assist the game's ability to run properly and prevent problems such as slowdown from happening. When you take this expansion cart into account, it becomes even more clear as to why at one point Capcom wanted to release the game exclusively for the Saturn. Speaking of the Saturn version, sadly it would remain exclusive to Japan due to Sega's continuous reduction of support for the system in North America and Europe due to a lack of hardware and software sales. This, however, did not stop Western game stores such as Electronic Boutique from importing the game from Japan and selling it to its consumers regardless. The Sega Saturn remains a popular system with importers right up until this day, and it's games like Xmen vs Street Fighter that encourage this trend in behaviour. So, now we have talked about the Saturn version of the game, we need to move on to talking about the Sony Playstation version. And this is where things begin to get really juicy. The PlayStation version would not be ready for a dual launch with the Saturn version as planned, which instantly should have had your alarm bells ringing. The game would eventually see a release on the PlayStation in Japan in February of 1998, 4 months after the Saturn version, and would not get to America until June and Europe and Australia till the winter. Anyway, releasing games that way was common protocol for the time, but it was the lack of dual console launches that appear a little more disturbing in this tale, particularly when you take into account Capcom initially never wanted to make a PlayStation version at all, and in many ways were pressured into the situation. As expected with a PlayStation port of the game, the memory limitations would require the title to be scaled down and altered in terms of both gameplay and graphics for the system. This would include Capcom needing to remove several character animation frames from the game to get the game to run on the PlayStation hardware. Whilst all of this was key in getting the game to run on the device, the most notable and shocking omission from this version of the game was the removal of the tag team combat, a staple of the game and a mechanic that was one of the biggest features that made the game stand out from the pack. In this watered down version of the game, the second character is only used during certain attacks, such as variable combinations for example, and the ability to switch between characters at will is completely gone. To compensate this tag change, 1-round battles are changed to the regular 2 out of 3 falls encounters found in the majority of other generic fighting games from the period. Interestingly, a sort of tag match can still be experienced in the game, however only with the use of a cheat code. The reason why I say only a sort of tag match is because to make this possible, both you and your opponent have to play as the same 2 characters, due to the PlayStation's lack of ability to keep 4 different character animations in its working memory simultaneously. The gimped PlayStation version of Xmen vs Street Fighter would result in some absolutely hilarious reviews at the time, with many journalists completely chastising this version of the game. Next Generation, for example, who we have touched on several times in this video, stated, "If you've never seen a Capcom fighting game before, this might be fun for a few minutes, but there is not one single positive thing to be said for the trade-offs that Capcom made to get this game to the PlayStation. Ouch." Game Revolution adds to this conversion's criticism by stating the game is a poor conversion of its arcade counterpart. The graphics aren't going to impress anyone either. If you're looking for a game that is a better arcade translation, check out Tekken 3, or wait for Street Fighter vs the Care Bears, due out later this year. My favourite of these angry reviews came from GameSpot, which is hilarious to read throughout. The opening paragraph to their review features a level of salt that is so intense it had me chuckling upon digesting every sentence. The opening paragraph reads, "When a system is incapable of doing justice to a game, one would think a company would be smart enough to not release the game on that system. But for reasons that are probably based entirely around making money, Capcom has released a completely butchered version of its arcade fighter, Xmen vs Street Fighter, on the PlayStation." Amongst this scathing review, They also state that the graphics look very washed out, and there is a completely unacceptable amount of slowdown. Kenshiryu Super Combo had most of the frames chopped out, and it still slows the game down to a crawl. The slowdown and missing frames are so bad and so noticeable that they have a detrimental effect on the already bad gameplay. The ruthless review closes with, "At some point in the development cycle, someone should have stepped in, seen that the PlayStation simply couldn't do justice to the original game and pulled the plug. I like the Street Fighter series as much as the next guy, but this is taking it way too far." Now, going back to me and my personal opinion on this whole matter, I believe as gimped as this game is compared to its Saturn and arcade counterparts, it really is not anywhere near as bad as some of these reviewers make out. This is a game I personally own, and when I was younger I never noticed a difference between this title and the arcade version due to the amount of time that would have elapsed between playthroughs of both of these games. So basically, unless you were lucky enough to have played the Sega Saturn version, or been fortunate enough to have played the arcade version of this game in the wild a lot, then you're not really going to be aware of all the changes necessarily anyway. So for a member of the casual audience, which I would infer make up the majority of the viewers today, and the people who would have wanted to play this game on the PlayStation, the game really does not look any worse than other 2D fighters that can be found amongst the PlayStation's library. In all of this anger that seemed to be directed towards Capcom in these reviews, you could argue that the reviewers should have been angry with the PlayStation user base instead, who chose to back a system that performed poorer at handling 2D games than that of the other system on the market. Obviously, you would sometimes hope that game reviewers are the most hardcore of hardcore gamers, which upon reading a lot of the Xmen vs Street Fighter Capcom reviews very much seems to be the case. However, with this wealth of experience playing all the different versions of the same game, you are going to build up a very different perspective of the title to those who simply started out by picking up a PlayStation version of the game. From Capcom's perspective, their hands were clearly a bit tied in this situation, as the PlayStation essentially was the only system worth making games for in the West during the game's release window. They entered this whole situation very reluctantly and were simply answering consumer demand, the very best that they possibly could with the hardware they had at their disposal. All in all, it is very clear that if you want to experience Xmen vs Street Fighter at its best, the arcade or the Sega Saturn are the ways to go. However, the PlayStation version is not the total garbage it was made out to be upon the game's release. To summarise, the Xmen vs Street Fighter release story is an interesting one full of controversy, criticism and even critical acclaim. The game has a legacy as polarising as any that is both astonishing and hilarious in equal measures to go back and explore. So with the commercial success this game found, it would only be a matter of time before Capcom would want to visit this concept once again. Oh yeah, and when I say a matter of time, I mean just 10 months. The sequel to the Street Fighter X-Men crossover would arrive in Japanese arcades as quick as July 1997. This game would once again be programmed to run off the Capcom CP System 2 arcade hardware, and features a game intro video that is cool enough to make anyone want to insert their precious small round things into this cabinet's lovely slot. So with that said, I may as well show you the intro now.
Are you ready, true believers? Capcom and Marvel have joined forces once again to bring you in Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter! Survive! Uncanny adventure! Don't miss out on the enjoyment of a lifetime! Behold, amazing fantasy! Don't miss the most amazing tag team fighting game ever! Are you ready for a new challenger? Right now, experience Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter! Welcome to the adventure!
Past these delightfully flashy scenes, the player reaches the character select screen, which instantly shows off a roster of characters that differ from the game's predecessor. On the Street Fighter side of things, we once again have 9 characters from the franchise, with just 2 characters changed in the lineup from that of which we received in the X-Men vs Street Fighter game. The two characters that were replaced are both Charlie and Cammy. Charlie's absence comes as no surprise at all to me, as just like I stated in my previous video, I certainly would not consider him one of the more memorable members of the Street Fighter cast. The absence of Cammy though, for me, is a little more puzzling, as apart from being one of the most popular characters from the franchise, the animation sprites for the whole Street Fighter roster in X-Men vs Street Fighter were ported directly from the arcade version of Street Fighter Alpha 2, with of course the exception of Cammy. My original confusion on this matter was actually due to the fact that Cammy was created specifically for X-Men vs Street Fighter, but went on to appear in Street Fighter Alpha 2 anyway, by having Capcom move her over to the home versions of Street Fighter Alpha 2. So to fully clarify the situation, she is not in the arcade version of Alpha 2, but in the home versions as a secret character. Glad to fully clear that one up for the comment section. Actually no, it does appear even more confusing than that, as the home conversion that included Cammy that was released in the United States was marketed as Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold. But then, after that version of the game ended up being released in Japanese arcades as Street Fighter 02 Alpha, which is a bit of a mouthful. But you know Capcom, and they love releasing multiple variants of the same games over and over again. But yes, I thought I would give that little bit of information in this video because, you know, the comment section will be like, actually, because that's what some of you sickos like to do to me. Anyway, with Capcom caring enough about Cammy that they would make her specifically for their first Versus game, it seemed to me like an odd decision to leave her out of the next installment in the series, especially when you notice she has been replaced by Sakura, another female fighter, but this time dressed as a Japanese schoolgirl. To me, this character looks a lot less memorable than the likes of Cammy, Chun-Li, and even Rose. So it seems a bit odd to me that they would choose to use her in this game over Cammy. Looking at the schoolgirl outfit and Cammy's previous raunchy attire, this instantly got me pondering if this decision was made due to some bizarre Japanese sex fetishization or something. So with this in mind, it got me looking slightly into why Sakura existed in the first place. Upon doing some research, the character creator, Akira Yasuda, was actually very concerned with regards to how the Street Fighter Alpha team, and more importantly the general public, would perceive this character. In his own words, he stated that she was a character outside the game's narrow worldview. Past this, he goes on to say that Sakura's character type was due to a popular archetype from works such as Sailor Moon. As characters, female high school students are all powerful in Japan. So from this quote, the inspiration behind Sakura becomes as clear as day, along with her inclusion in the game over Cammy, due to the fact that she is a character based on a popular Japanese superhero, who is being placed into a game where she can fight a whole range of superheroes from the West. So it all makes a lot more sense when you look into things. Charlie, on the other hand, was replaced with Dan, a fellow member of the Street Fighter Alpha roster. Dan basically looks like a poor man's Ryu, or Ken, but what makes this more amusing is that it was the intention the entire time. Essentially, Capcom always saw SNK's Art of Fighting star, Ryo Sakazaki and Robert Garcia, as Ken and Ryu ripoffs. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, I did say Ryu, because I'm a bloody Englishman and not a bloody weeb. So in response to this, they created Dan, as a parody character of those two. Due to this, Dan is portrayed as an overconfident, arrogant, and utterly feeble character, all in all making him more memorable than Charlie. Obviously, on the Marvel side of things get a little bit more interesting, as in the previous game in the series, we only had a selection of X-Men characters to choose from, whereas now, the game features characters from the greater Marvel universe. Only Cyclops and Wolverine make a return in this game from the previous entry, opening the other 6 roster spots up to other characters. The game has added to the roster 3 of the biggest names from the world of Marvel, in the form of Captain America, the Incredible Hulk, and Spider-Man. So far, all of the Marvel characters I have mentioned have had their sprites taken from previous Capcom fighting games. Cyclops and Wolverine originate from Children of the Atom, whereas Hulk, Spider-Man and Captain America were taken from the Marvel Superheroes fighting game. In terms of the remaining roster spots, villains from the Marvel superhero games, Shuma-Gorath and Blackheart were also moved over, whereas X-Men villain Omega Red has been moved over from Children of the Atom as well. There are some secret characters to find too, but these are all palette swaps of existing characters anyway, with alternative movesets, which include the likes of Dark Sakura and Metal Zangief, just to name a few. Moving past the roster, I guess it's time to discuss the gameplay. If you watched my X-Men vs Street Fighte video, not very much has changed here in terms of how the game actually performs, and its mechanics. You're essentially getting a similar experience with tweaks here and there, along with a selection of new characters to play as. Essentially, think of this as an upgrade to the previous game rather than a totally new experience. A good comparison in this regard to make would be like if you played Street Fighter 2, then went on to play Street Fighter 2 Turbo or Super Street Fighter 2. It is more of an upgraded experience rather than a totally new game. However, that is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. Mechanics that made the last game enjoyable, such as selecting two characters on the player select screen, make a return. As a result, once again, nearly every match is a tag team match player, once again making this one of Teddy Long's favourite games. Holla holla holla! After a series of tag team matches, you will end up going one-on-one with The Undertaker. Well, close enough. You end up in a 2-on-1 encounter against Apocalypse, who once again, like in the previous game, takes up nearly the entire screen, which is bloody cool in my opinion. The game differs though, as there is one more boss fight. Past Apocalypse, this time in the form of Cyber Akuma, who is basically just the Terminator wearing a pair of sandals. Scary stuff, eh? So the tag in tag out makes a return, along with the other mechanics such as the gauges at the bottom of the screen, which depending on how full they are, allow the player to perform big moves and hyper combos. As traditional with Capcom games, new fighting mechanics are usually trickled into their games, and in Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter's case, the notable addition to the gameplay is something known as variable assists. Using this new technique, a player can summon their off-screen fighter to perform a special attack without switching their currently controlled fighter out of play. This opens up a realm of new possible combos during matches, which further expand on the purpose of having a second character at your disposal. All in all, this improves on the tag team action, and as a result, this mechanic was continually carried over to further entries in the Versus series. According to a gentleman known as Seth Killian, who is a former Capcom USA community manager, he stated that with regards to this game, the primary goal was to tone down the insanity that occurred on screen when compared to X-Men vs Street Fighter. Basically, what he meant by this was that the developers wanted to achieve the feat of turning this title into a more balanced fighting experience. In the previous video, I mentioned that Capcom would release 3 different versions of X-Men vs Street Fighter in an attempt to remove all infinite combos that featured in the game. It turns out these combos were never planned content and were only there due to insufficient beta testing. As a result, Capcom did their best to try and remove all known infinites. However, their efforts were ultimately futile that time around. Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, however, gave the developers the opportunity to rewrite what they perceived as wrongs, so this time sought out to create a game they viewed as less broken. To be fair to Capcom, they were fairly successful in achieving this feat. However, quite amusingly, fan reception at the time was fairly negative with regards to these changes, as they looked at the game to be offering them less freedom than with the previous entry. After all, the chaotic nature of X-Men vs Street Fighter was one of the reasons that many people fell in love with the game to begin with. Obviously, like with many Capcom games, it would only be a matter of time until it saw home ports. As we know, the games share many similarities with X-Men vs Street Fighter, so porting the games over to home consoles in theory should not have proven any more difficult really than with its predecessor. Regarding porting, last week we discussed how vastly different the console versions of Capcom's first Versus game fared on each system, with the Sega Saturn version of the game outclassing its PlayStation counterpart in every single department. So, as expected again today, we are going to analyse the two home variants of Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, and also take a peek at how each game was viewed upon release. Did the PlayStation version show improvement this time around? Well, let's take a look at both now. The first home version of this game would see a release in October of 1998. The title would appear on the Sega Saturn exclusively in Japan, 15 months after its arcade debut. Once again, the Saturn port was supported by the 4MB RAM expansion peripheral, allowing the developers to create a conversion which retained the original frame rates and tag team system. In regards to this game's critical response from journalists, GameSpot review of the Saturn title was a mixed bag, as they stated, "Graphically, the game is very good. The sprites are extremely well animated, and the backgrounds are all packed with movement, giving the game a nice, busy look." It's a perfect conversion of the arcade game, that much we know, but that doesn't really stop it from being a near carbon copy of Xmen vs Street Fighter. That also doesn't stop it from having the same button masher friendly gameplay as its predecessor. It's pretty much a given that this version is going to easily smoke the PlayStation version. If you're still interested in the Saturn, then this game is definitely one to import. Digital Extremes gave the game a glowing review, summarising that the title is another arcade perfect 4MB translation from Capcom. Too bad it's probably going to be the last. If you're looking for a great Saturn fighter, give Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter a shot. German publication Video Games added to the conversion's praise by stating, "The game gives the beat 'em up community another potential fun hit. As you would expect, you will be spoiled with excellent animated characters and backgrounds. Marvel vs Street Fighter is another Saturn jewel in the 2D fighting game genre." So, looking at all these reviews and looking at the conversion myself, it is easy to conclude that once again Capcom had managed to pull off the feat of getting this game to run fantastically on the Saturn, looking near arcade perfect as a result. The only real drawback of the game is that essentially it really is just Xmen vs Street Fighter, with a different roster and a few simple tweaks, just as I highlighted earlier in the video, with the arcade version of the game. As far as arcade conversions go, this is as good as it gets really. Before we finally move on to the PlayStation version of the game, there is one more character I thought I would save talking about until we reach the Saturn portion of this video, and that is a ridiculous playable character known as Nori Maru. Due to licensing issues, this character can only be found in the Japanese versions of the game, with the Saturn version obviously being left in Japan due to the Saturn being essentially a dead system in the West by this point. Nori Maru can be found on every Saturn disc. The character is the creation of a Japanese comedian, Noritake Kinashi, so, as expected, is placed in the zany game as a sort of comic relief character. One final note worth mentioning in regards to the Saturn version of the game is that an additional mode of play had been added to the conversion. This extra bit of content is known as Survival Mode, which basically lets you square off against multiple opponents using just one life bar. Moving ahead to discussing the PlayStation version of Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, the game would be reported on in October of 1998 by IGN, which was 4 months before this conversion would arrive on the system in February of 1999. IGN reported that Capcom were aiming to circumvent PlayStation's memory restrictions at least partially, due to the negative backlash that had hampered the PlayStation version of Xmen vs Street Fighter previously. Upon the game's February 1999 PlayStation release, the game would feature 5 modes of play, known as Battle, Versus, Training, Hero Battle and Crossover Mode. Sadly though, once again Teddy Long was very disappointed, as the conversion was once again missing the tag team mechanic, which was obviously due to the same reasons as before, where the PlayStation was not able to hold 4 character animations in its working memory simultaneously. The notable modes out of the 5 mentioned earlier were Hero Battle and Crossover Mode, which we shall discuss now. Hero Battle is a sort of endurance mode where both yourself and your opponent pick a selection of fighters each. The competitor who manages to KO the entirety of the opposing team is declared the winner. Crossover Mode is explained by GameSpot as follows. This mode allows you to pick 2 characters, then the computer uses the same characters you picked. This limits the amount of information the PlayStation has to handle to 2 characters instead of 4. If you are victorious in this battle, the computer swaps one of the characters each of you have for another. This is done so that you aren't playing with and against the same 2 characters each fight. To put it simply, this mode is kind of compensatory for the traditional tag action being missing. However, reviewers such as GameSpot were unimpressed by this, stating that it gives you the tag team experience of the arcade, but having to deal with the rotating character thing and having to fight mirror images of yourself is extremely weak in comparison. Speaking of GameSpot, they were the entity who in my last video gave Xmen vs Street Fighter on the PlayStation an outrageous verbal bashing overall. However, this time around they did not seem to hold quite as harsh an opinion on this one, and their opinion appears to be a little more balanced. GameSpot stated that visually Marvel Super Heroes vs Street Fighter looks good, but when you compare it with its arcade counterpart it simply fails. The colours aren't nearly as vibrant and the game suffers from quite a bit of slowdown. Street Fighter fans will definitely feel the typical Street Fighter gameplay, but in the end it's all a question of how starved you are for another Street Fighter game. IGN added similar review feedback stating that while there is no denying that Marvel's Super Heroes vs Street Fighter is a fast, fun and solid fighting game, it certainly isn't without flaws. The aforementioned lack of true tag play is one that will seriously affect players who are used to the arcade version. I certainly wouldn't recommend it to those who didn't enjoy Xmen vs Street Fighter, or are looking for something truly innovative from their next fighting game. All in all, the 3 versions of this game all display a range of similarities in terms of both strengths and weaknesses with the 3 versions that were released of Xmen vs Street Fighter the previous years. You could make a strong case overall that these 3 games, although very similar to their predecessors, offer a range of improvements over the Xmen vs game. The PlayStation version of the game probably shows the strongest improvement out of the 3, but once again trails behind both the arcade and Saturn conversions of the title. Today the game is viewed by many as the black sheep of the Marvel vs Capcom franchise, due to the game's lack of infinite combos and chaotic action that has become a staple of the series. Chaos is an element that defines the series, which was accidentally established in the original Xmen vs Street Fighter game. However, if you are looking for a fighter that is a little more balanced, controlled and traditional in terms of gameplay, then I guess this would be the game from the series that is probably right for you. This attention to detail in terms of fighting mechanics is what makes the game special, after all. At this point, it brings us to the exact game we are looking at in detail today, Marvel vs Capcom Clash of the Superheroes, released in 1998. I noted last week that there was only a 10-month gap between the release of Xmen vs Street Fighter and Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, which is an incredibly small amount of time even by Capcom standards. Even more ridiculously though, there would be an even smaller window with Marvel vs Capcom, as this one would come out only 6 months after the last entry in the series, which is insane when you think about it. So to expand on the crossover idea, since the game incorporated the roster of Street Fighter characters alongside fighters from the greater Marvel universe, the next logical step in the series was to expand the roster on the Capcom side of things, by stretching the next game to include characters from other Capcom games, rather than just Street Fighter. So with all this in mind, let us look at Capcom introducing us to this concept via the game's introductory video.
Capcom presents
Marvel vs. Capcom! Come on! Marvel vs. Capcom!
From the initial character select screen, you will notice that this game initially offers 15 different playable characters, including the return of several from the previous game in the series. In terms of Street Fighters, Ryu, Chun-Li and Zangief all make a return, whilst on the Marvel side of things, Wolverine, Spider-Man, Captain America and the Hulk are all back. On top of this, Gambit also makes a return for the first time since Xmen vs Street Fighter. If you can count, you may have noted that I just listed off 8 fighters, meaning the other 7 characters are all brand new additions to this crossover series, and all in all decent additions they are, so let us briefly touch on each of them. There are only 2 new fighters from Marvel, so let us start off by covering those. Firstly, we have War Machine from the Iron Man franchise, who may or may not be a palette swap of Iron Man from the Marvel superheroes fighting game. And secondly, we have Venom, who is probably my all-time favourite Marvel character. When I was a child playing this game, this Spider-Man villain would always be one of my go-to choices as a result. I was clearly not alone in my adoration for Venom either, as the character has been considered significant enough in recent years to have even had his standalone feature-length film. Moving over to the Capcom side of things, the roster would include another one of my childhood favourites, and as a result, another one of my go-to fighters at the time, Mega Man. Mega Man always felt particularly special to me, as I was always the only person at school who liked or had even heard of the franchise. You have to remember, I lived in the UK, so most people skipped the NES due to the lack of a video game crash. As a result, the system was the 7th most popular 8-bit platform to game on. This would mean most people would miss out on the Mega Man games. Nintendo consoles only got popular in the UK after the release of Street Fighter 2, as the popularity of the arcade game gave people a reason to want to own a Super Nintendo console, so they could bring that arcade experience home. Despite this though, Mega Drive owners always still significantly outnumbered Super Nintendo owners, and even if you did have a Super Nintendo, you more than likely skipped the Mega Man X games, due to the titles having no brand recognition at all. I, on the other hand, was an exception to the rule, and due to a fantastic recommendation from an electronic boutique employee, I had all the Mega Man X games amongst my childhood collection. It was truly awesome to me to see what felt like, to me at least, was no more than a cult character to be featured alongside who I perceived to be superstars like Ryu and Spider-Man. Despite Mega Man's lack of success in the UK, I guess this was really the first glimpse of what a big deal this character was to some parts of the world. To accompany Mega Man, we also saw the debut of Strider Herald from the Strider hack and slash platforming series, Jinsei Atomi from the Servbot fighting series, Captain Commando from the 1991 side-scrolling beat-em-up, and of course Morrigan, who was quickly making a name for herself in the Capcom fighting game series known as Darkstalkers. So this game was a perfect fit for her really. Damn succubus. On top of the 15 initial playable characters, the game also features a number of secret characters, who a number of which are palette swaps, such as Shadow Lady, who is a variant of Chun-Li, and Red Venom, who is a palette swap of Venom. Roll is also present from the Mega Man series, who features the same moveset as Mega Man. However, at least with this one, she features her own unique sprite. Outside of the selectable playable characters, there are actually even more in-game characters to talk about. However, we shall get to the rest shortly. Now, in terms of actually playing this game, many of the mechanics established in the previous Marvel and Capcom crossover games make a welcomed return here. At the game's heart, once again, it is a traditional fighter. However, there are a number of additional elements that are included that enhance the action. This includes Teddy Long's favourite series staple, the tag team mechanic, where every match is a tag team match. This once again means you must choose 2 characters on the player select screen, who you can switch between at will during any time in a fight. Victory is achieved when both of your foes are downed by having both of their life bars depleted. The gauges at the bottom of the screen also make a return, that build up as you land attacks and can be utilised via the use of hyper combos and massive high energy blasts, so no changes in these areas discussed so far. Now let us touch on what has changed gameplay wise. Well, remember variable assists we talked about in last week's video? where the player could call upon their off-screen characters to perform special attacks, well, this feature has been removed. Instead, we have in its place a guest character special partner system, which brings me on to talking about what guest characters actually are. To put it simply, on top of the characters we have already discussed, there are a further 20 which are known as guest characters. There are some pretty famous faces amongst these: Cyclops, Jubilee, Thor, and even bloody Arthur from Ghosts and Goblins. These characters are drawn upon for extra support during battles and are randomly allocated to players prior to a fight. These can be called upon a few times per bout and can be used when executing new techniques that made their debut in this game, such as the variable cross, aka the duo team attack. The variable cross allows you to attack your opponent with both characters at the same time for a limited period. The game features an all-new soundtrack that mixes a range of completely new melodies with remixes of long-established tracks that have featured within previous Capcom games. Along with the musical changes, the game also introduced all new stage backdrops, a hugely welcome change when you take into account that Xmen vs Street Fighter and Marvel's Superheroes vs Street Fighter lazily both included the same stages. In addition to the new fighting mechanics, Apocalypse and Cyber Akuma, who were M-bosses in previous games, are now also absent, and in their place is a final encounter against Onslaught, who originates from the X-Men series. The fight with Onslaught is notorious for being amongst the most difficult bosses in fighting games, and is considered by many to be quite simply the hardest boss in this series. He can perform attacks that do colossal damage, and many that are inescapable. He has two challenging forms, the first of which is tall and highly evasive, the second of which can fly around the background, and he takes up most of the screen. Despite this though, only a small part of his body is vulnerable to damage, making this even more challenging. So that sums up just about everything in the arcade version of Marvel vs Capcom in one simple nutshell. Like with most Capcom games of the period, the changes made between this game and its predecessors were fairly subtle, and the biggest and most attractive change in the series was the title's roster. The game was a popular arcade choice, well, as far as popularity went with games in the arcades at this point anyway, so as expected it would only be a matter of time before ports of this game would begin to arrive in homes. Now, with previous entries in the series, they have been ported over to the Sony Playstation and Sega Saturn, with the Sega Saturn versions of the game massively outperforming the versions found on the PlayStation. By this point in time, Sega had released an all-new home console in the form of the Sega Dreamcast, so this time around, Capcom had even more power at their home disposal than with their previous crossover games. The arcade version of the game, that was obviously developed for the CP System 2 arcade hardware, was revealed that it would be ported over to the Dreamcast during the 1998 Tokyo Game Show. This version of the game would be particularly special, as it would feature a mode known as Cross Viva, which would allow up to 4 separate players competing in the same tag team matches simultaneously. The Dreamcast version of the game, which was ported to the Dreamcast in 1999, would go on to receive rave reviews from journalists such as GameSpot, stating, "Graphically, Marvel vs Capcom looks terrific, and once and for all proves that the Dreamcast can definitely do justice to 2D games. Even when all 4 characters are on screen, filling the arena with projectiles whilst the background goes crazy, the game doesn't slow down a bit. The utter lack of load times keeps the game moving along at a nice brisk pace. The soundtrack, which comprises music from all sorts of different Capcom games, is unmatched. The game's sound effects are also crystal clear and extremely well done. The copious use of stereo separation helps make the audio perfect. While I wouldn't call Marvel vs Capcom the most balanced fighting game in the world, it makes up for its shortcomings by simply being a whole lot of fun. After pumping out inferior versus games for a few years now, Capcom have finally gotten it right. Marvel vs Capcom is everything you'd expect from the over-the-top, ultra-flashy fighter, and then some. IGN had equal praise for the game, particularly in the graphical department. They were very impressed with the game's art style and expressed this by saying, "Everything from the way Venom moves his tongue to Gambit's trench coat blowing in the wind is done with such precision that feasting your eyes upon it is more like experiencing a Saturday morning cartoon than a video game. At even the most frantic moments of combo madness, the backgrounds and characters move just as fluidly as they did before the insanity began. In fact, it is so visually orgasmic that I couldn't help but smile, and smile big, whenever something cool happened. 32-bit systems can't do this stuff, folks." IGN went on to praise all the modes of gameplay this version of the game includes, such as the return of survival mode and the introduction of cross fever. To summarise, they stated, "Taking everything into consideration, Marvel vs. Capcom is an excellent post-launch purchase. With the mini glut of fighting titles available for the system by the end of October, this is definitely one of your better choices, if not the best. It's certainly the best 2D title on the system until Street Fighte Alpha 3 rolls into town, so don't pass this one up." So, as demonstrated by the Dreamcast version of Marvel vs. Capcom's universal praise, the game is not only arcade perfect, but offers a range of play modes that can only be experienced in this version of the game, arguably making this game better than what could be experienced in the arcades, which, to be frank, was what this Sega Dreamcast was all about. The platform was far ahead of its time, and in many ways more powerful and innovative than systems that would precede it several years later. Now, moving away from the Dreamcast version of the game, we have to also touch on the PlayStation version. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, in the days of the Dreamcast, some losers were still playing their Sony Playstations. I was not poor enough at the time to need to be honest, but apparently some people were. So Capcom would release a gimped version of the game for this aging piece of underpowered hardware. Now, you know what to expect from this series on the PlayStation by this point, as each port of the Versus series on it features certain characteristics, such as missing animation frames, long load times, and saddest of all, a lack of proper tag team matches, which is the main mechanic that separates these games from other traditional fighters. By the time of this game's release, everyone really already knew what to expect from this game on the system. This would include journalists, so I would say that in some ways the level of criticism does not seem as harsh as with Xmen vs Street Fighte just a couple of years earlier. GameSpot summarised the perception of this game perfectly by stating that, graphically, the game really doesn't look too bad, taking into consideration the limitations of the hardware. The game is colourful and the backgrounds are nice. New to the PlayStation version is a quick zoom that occurs during throws. This is a little disorientating and the characters get pretty pixelated up close as well. The audio portion of the game is troublesome. Everything sounds extremely tinny, and the trebly sound and music will get on your nerves almost immediately. If you're looking for the arcade version, you really need to go to an arcade or pick up the Dreamcast version. The PlayStation version may have the same moves as the original game, but the shell surrounding those moves is completely different. Rent this one first. So, as you can see, by the time Marvel vs. Capcom reached home systems, the class divide between the game on the Sega system and Sony's had become even greater. But by this point that had become pretty much expected, particularly when you take into account how previous games performed on the hardware and the fact that the Sega Dreamcast was the state of the art at the time. So all in all, I would say that this game continued to take significant steps forward with relation to the evolution of the Marvel vs. Capcom series. This game was certainly the most ambitious crossover event in history to date, and a significant chapter in gaming history right up until this day. This was the game that solidified the Marvel vs. Capcom name as a brand of fighting games in its own right, and as fantastic as this game was, the very best was still to come. Marvel vs. Capcom 2, The New Age of Heroes, is the direct sequel to Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of the Superheroes. The game would appear in the arcades early within the year 2000, over 2 years after the previous entries in the series. This 2-year break from the series was the longest gap between releases yet, as the first 3 Capcom vs games would only have a matter of months between each release. As a tradition with these videos, we normally take a quick look at the game's introductory scene, as it usually gives us a glimpse of what is to come. So with this in mind, let us look back at the intro for Marvel vs Capcom 2 The New Age of Heroes.
Capcom presents
Ready?
Marvel vs. Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes.
Now, I have to say that the introduction to the game certainly did not instill me with the same feeling of hype that all the previous entries in the series did with their intro packages. Unlike other Capcom vs game intros, there is no footage of the fighters in action. Neither is there an announcer shouting out the name of the game or other fun phrases like "Welcome to the adventure." Instead, we are pretty much just shown a huge list of features the game includes, along with artwork of some of the characters who appear in the game. I guess the long list of new features must have been what Capcom was most proud of about this one, which would make a lot of sense considering how similar the first 3 games in the series were. There were minor mechanical differences between all the previous games, but the biggest changes between each was simply the roster of characters available. The 3 titles all offered less than 20 playable characters each, but had a different lineup depending on the game's theme. So for a quick run through of these, the first title mixed characters from Street Fighte and Xmen, with most of the character sprites taken from Street Fighte Alpha and Xmen Children of the Atom. Whereas the second game mixed characters from Street Fighte and the greater Marvel universe, meaning that character sprites would once again be ripped from the Alpha series, but this time instead of Children of the Atom, many sprites would come from the Marvel Superheroes fighting game. In the third installment, Marvel vs Capcom, sprites once again got plucked from previous games we have mentioned. However, this time, since the game incorporated the greater Capcom universe, many sprites for this installment would need to be produced from scratch. So, reflecting back on these 3 games, Capcom had milked the Street Fighter roster for this series, the Marvel universe, and had even pulled over some of their best characters from other games, such as Mega Man and Morrigan. So what could they do with Marvel vs Capcom 2 to make the game stand out from the pack? Well, quite a bloody lot as it goes, as the game's introduction has already suggested to us. As one would hope, the game is yet another crossover fighting game featuring a roster of characters from various different franchises across both the Marvel and Capcom universes. A departure from the norm that you would instantaneously notice is that the character artwork remains in glorious 2D, whereas the backgrounds and visual effects have been rendered in 3D this time around, instantly giving the game a distinct look against the title's predecessors. This in turn technically makes the game the first in the franchise to feature a 2.5D graphical style. Before we move on to talking about all the mechanical changes and modes this game received, let us talk about the bloody roster, as, in my opinion, it is one of the greatest things about this game. You start the game out with a character selection of 24, but there are another 32 to unlock. All in all, giving you a roster of a whopping 56 characters. A selection of characters that was so large it was almost unheard of in other fighting games at the moment in time the game saw release. The game's exciting roster would see a return of most of the characters from the previous Capcom vs games, along with characters who had not been seen in fighting games since the likes of X-Men Children of the Atom and Marvel superheroes such as Psylocke and Iron Man for example. Before we move on, let us look at some additions to the roster who have not appeared in this franchise or the Marvel fighting games previously. Firstly, on the Marvel side of things, we have 2 new playable characters. These consist of Cable, who is the son of Cyclops and Jean Grey, Then we have Maru, a mutant whose bones grow out of her skin and can be removed from her body, providing her with potential knives and clubs, as well as body armour. On the Capcom side of things, there are even more new fighters though, so let's run through them. Firstly, we have a Mingo, who bizarrely has never even appeared in any games outside of the Capcom Vs series. There have been rumours that he is a rejected Darkstalkers character, whereas other sources point to his game being cancelled altogether. A Mingo is a round cactus humanoid wearing Mexican clothes and a sombrero, who carries a guitar with him. Ah, the good old days when cultural appropriation was still cool. Also, without a game of her own, we also have Ruby Hart, a French-speaking pirate captain who earned a prominent reputation sailing the seas. She too has no game and is rumoured to be a cancelled Darkstalkers character. However, in 2016, the Capcom website established that she is the younger sister of the main characters from the puzzle game, pirate ship Higimaru Momotaru, Bows and Beards. Once again, speaking of Darkstalkers, Morrigan makes a return to the Versus franchise, but this time is joined by Anakaris and Felicia, enhancing Darkstalkers' prominence within the Capcom Vs series. Mega Man and Roll are back too, but this time joined by characters from the Mega Man Legends series, which I guess was still sort of relevant around this game's release. So from the Mega Man universe, the new additions to the roster include Tron Bonne, an anti-hero who is a member of the Bond family of air pirates, who would receive a Capcom game in her own right titled The Misadventures of Tron Bonne. Joining her there is also a character known as Servbot, one of many all-purpose support robots that Tron Bonne built. One of the most surprising roster members added was Sun, a monkey bot from an arcade shoot-'em-up from all the way back in 1984. A really surprising inclusion in my opinion, especially considering the depth of characters Capcom would have had to choose from. Finally, in the new characters department, we have Jill Valentine, whose addition would be no surprise at all when you consider the massive success of Resident Evil during the 90s. The anime art style she is depicted in this game is also massively refreshing and different from her appearances in any games previously, all in all making her my favourite addition to the Marvel vs Capcom roster. So now we have gotten through talking about all the new characters, let's switch up to talking about the development of this huge game. As mentioned in previous videos, all the prior Versus games were programmed to run on Capcom System 2 arcade boards. Marvel vs Capcom 2 on the other hand was developed to run on completely different hardware. In fact, this was the first ever fighting game that Capcom would develop themselves that did not utilise the abilities of Capcom arcade boards at all. Instead, the game would be developed to run on the Sega Naomi arcade board, a board that used the same electronic components as the Sega Dreamcast. The Naomi had twice as much system memory, twice as much video memory, and 4 times as much sound memory as its home console counterpart. But all in all, this was the perfect hardware to make a game on that was intended to be ported over to the powerful Sega home console. The game was first announced on December 1st, 1999, and on that same day it was revealed that the Japanese home and arcade versions would be compatible with each other via the use of the Dreamcast VMU. The feature announced would allow players to exchange data between the two versions, earning them experience points which could be used to unlock characters, stages and costumes. It was also announced that day that the game would feature online play between Dreamcast players, which was available through a network known as Match Service. Due to technical limitations of the time, this feature was removed from all international ports of the Dreamcast game. Due to the technical similarities between the Naomi and the Dreamcast, it would only be a matter of months in Japan before the arcade version of the game would reach homes in March of 2000. The game would also reach other shores around the world by the summer of that same year. Now let's finally talk about gameplay mechanics of this title. Marvel vs Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes once again brings back tag team fighting, which is why Teddy Long loves this series over any other gaming franchise. Play modes this time around deviate though, offering the player more choice than ever before. Holla holla holla! Instead of just picking 2 fighters for yourself to face off in tag team action, instead this time around we have the option to pick 3 fighters to face off against opponents in 3-on-3 combat. instantly establishing a very practical purpose for the game's huge roster of fighters. Like in previous games, if a damaged character tags out, they can slowly regenerate health when not in play. The variable system also makes a return in this game, however this time it is even more refined. Just like in previous games, you can tag in and tag out at will, taking advantage of the characters you have selected, winning matches when you have depleted the life bar of your opponent's whole team. The variable assist mechanic, first introduced in Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, is back, allowing players to call upon their off-screen teammates to join their currently selected characters to perform a single special move to aid them. Due to this, the guest character assist first found in Marvel vs Capcom has now been removed. All characters also have 3 assists each, which can vary from projectile moves to healing techniques. The hyper combo gauge also returns, which is gradually filled as players both deal and receive damage. Once this is full, characters can once again use this power to perform hyper combos that deal heavy damage. To add to this, using the meter, the player can also perform delayed hyper combos that execute multiple hyper combos simultaneously, and variable combinations, which allow the player to use all 3 of their characters to perform hyper combos at the same time. Other mechanical changes include something known as snapback, which forces opponents to switch between characters, and the game's actual controls have been modified too, changing from a title that features 6 different attack buttons to 4 attack buttons and 2 assist buttons. This move is said to have taken place in order to make the game more accessible to casual players. The game would obviously feature both single and multiplayer modes of play. The game's arcade mode obviously and traditionally consists of the player fighting their way through various encounters until finally reaching the game's end boss. Prior to the last boss, the player must defeat 7 teams of 3 to reach their destination. The final boss fight itself takes place against Abyss, who in typical final boss fashion has 3 different forms in which you must defeat. In this particular instance, the 3 forms also allow for the 3-on-3 playstyle of the game to persist in some way throughout the fight. Abyss is a character who was created specifically for this game, who happens to be a legendary creature forgotten by time and is believed to be just a fairy tale. Abyss is said to be a forbidden weapon sealed away in an underground temple where it spent untold centuries in a deep sleep. According to the game's lore, Ruby Hart was the one who accidentally awoke this character, who as a result would transport the Capcom and Marvel fighters via her airship in order to help stop this beast. Along with the game's arcade mode, the title also offers players a training mode, which allows you to practice moves and combos whilst not in direct competitive combat. On top of this, there is also a score attack mode, which is similar to arcade mode, only with a primary objective being to get as high a score as possible, without the need for a continue. Another new addition to the game, which I briefly talked about when touching on the game's original announcement, is the experience system this game contains. This is present in the arcade version as an incentive to unlock hidden characters, but the Dreamcast version switches this out for what is known as the Secret Factor menu. Basically, when perusing this menu, players can browse this feature and purchase characters, costumes and stages through the use of the points they have earned throughout their playthrough. This element of the game gives the title a level of single player replayability that is arguably a lot higher than with previous entries in the Capcom vs series, or any of the previous Street Fighter games either for that matter. The quest for Unlockables is a great incentive to keep players coming back, wondering what else the game has to offer, and a tantalising prospect for completionists who enjoy trying to attain everything within a game. To me, this is the kind of feature that should be in every game, let alone just fighters, as it is an easy incentive and a pat on the back to just keep going. But then again, most greedy developers prefer to just put additional content behind paywalls instead nowadays. So Unlockables you attain through skill or resilience, or a dying gaming feature today. But if you like this sort of thing, Marvel vs Capcom 2 on the Dreamcast gives you it. So now that we have gone through a rundown of the game and its many features, let's hear what some of the journalists and critics thought of this game on release. Did they like the game as much as many people do today? Let us find out. GameSpot reviewed the game favourably, stating, The over-the-top nature of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 makes the other Versus games look subdued by comparison. Like its predecessor, it isn't the most balanced game in the world, but that doesn't keep it from being a great deal of fun. Fans of the off-kilter action found in the previous Versus games will surely be pleased with Marvel vs. Capcom 2, as it represents the first major set of changes the series has ever seen. IGN would lump a ton of praise on the title too, stating Capcom sets a new watermark in the Versus series of fighters. All fighting fans must have this game. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 proves to be one of the best fighting games out there, one of the Dreamcast most sparkling gems, and an awesome experience. Other publications would just carry on piling praise onto the game, with the Daily Radar proclaiming the title to be the most fun 2D fighter game of all time, and Hot Games echoing this sentiment by stating it's the best 2D fighting game ever made. So, from ploughing through these game reviews from nearly 20 years ago, it seems that the common consensus amongst journalists was that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was in fact the greatest 2D fighting game that had ever been made by that point. But personally, I do not feel this fully answers the question I posed at the start of this video quite yet. Plus, the Marvel vs. Capcom 2 story did not quite end in the year 2000 either. Fast forward to 2002 and the Sega Dreamcast would be dead. Sega had officially announced that they would be retiring from the hardware industry, and future Capcom games would therefore no longer be appearing on Sega systems. Which was a damn shame considering that previously the versions of their fighting games on those platforms had been the best versions around for quite some time. The fallout from this would result in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 receiving two ports, one version for the PlayStation 2 and the other for the Microsoft Xbox, which were both announced at the Electronic Entertainment Expo in 2002. Once again, like with the Dreamcast version of the game, online support would remain exclusive to Japan, despite this being 2 years removed from the game's previous release. GameSpot once again covered the release of this game, stated that the game had been perfectly translated for new consoles, but also stated that the game's graphics and art style were nowhere near as impressive looking as they were 2 years prior, stating the contrast between 2D and 3D doesn't work quite as well as you might like, and the resulting clash makes for sharp looking backgrounds and relatively pixelated character sprites. Which, to be fair to GameSpot, is a fair point, as a strong case could be made that the whole game would probably have aged even better if it was all in simple 2D. Although GameSpot still looked at the game very favourably, they no longer looked at it as one of the greatest 2D fighters ever, and would even go as far as to state that it has been surpassed on nearly every front since its original release. Games like Guilty Gear X have shown freshly animated, impressively sharp 2D sprites, and Capcom's later releases like Capcom vs SNK 2 are simply better games in almost every imaginable way. With regards to the 2002 release, they would summarise with, if you're a hardcore fan of Marvel vs Capcom 2, yet somehow missed the Dreamcast version when it was originally released, this game is a port that you will definitely enjoy, but anyone else can find better fighting games on the market. In regards to IGN, they would give the game praise, similar to their review 2 years earlier, although they were sorely disappointed with the lack of online play with the Western releases of the game. This sting was particularly sore when you take into account the rise of Xbox Live. They would also criticise the load times in comparison to that of the Dreamcast. Another interesting point to note is that unlike GameSpot, IGN would state that the game even beats out the later released Capcom vs SNK franchise. I guess illustrating how subjective these reviews actually are, and how all of us ultimately need to make our own judgments on many games. The game would resurface again the following generation on both the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. The reason for this was mainly due to the fact that a company known as Backbone Entertainment had developed Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix for the systems in 2008, a game that resulted in a lot of people playing competitively online. After this, many fans would request that they release Marvel vs Capcom 2 on the systems, with the online play function implemented, As a result, this would become a reality, and the game would be built using the original Dreamcast version's code as a base, the previously most refined home version of the game. Apart from online play, this version would utilise various filter options for character sprites, offering smooth, crisp and classic looks. Widescreen support was also implemented. These versions of the games would be available to purchase online until 2013, when Capcom announced that Marvel vs. Capcom 2 would be removed from the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network stores, following the apparent expiration of Capcom's licensing contract with Marvel Comics. Over the years, the games remained popular and now sits amongst the most iconic fighting games of all time. Since the game's release, it has always been played at fighting game tournaments too. But despite this, is it the greatest fighter of all time ever made? Well, to re-drum a point home I made earlier in the video, this sort of question can only really be subjectively answered, even when we put criteria in the way to help us reach such a conclusion. But for the sake of entertainment, here are my personal thoughts on the matter of this game. A case could be made to proclaim Marvel vs. Capcom 2 the greatest fighting game of all time. The roster is massive, the 3-on-3 mechanic was innovative, and the simplified controls made the game more accessible to players of all skill levels, more than any Versus game previously. To top this off, the crazy amount of unlockables gives this game tons of replay value to those who enjoy a single player completionist experience. In many ways, this fighting game offered more than any fighter previously. With this said, the game still has its flaws I have not really even touched upon up until this point. The music is subjectively awful and features a jazz soundtrack, ill-fitting of any fighting game. And although the roster of fighters is huge, only a handful of the fighters are competitive, all in all making the game pretty unbalanced. But then again, the Versus series is not really meant to be about balance in the first place. It's about chaos and fun, which this game offers in abundance. It is about different strokes for different folks really, but I can see why many people would get more enjoyment out of this game than others. It is just a fantastic casual experience. On the other end of the spectrum, many from the fighting game community would put a case forward for Street Fighter 3 to be the best fighting game ever made, due to the lush animation, balanced fighting and unique parry system, all in all contributing to the game's deep competitive nature. I, on the other hand, would simply classify Street Fighter 2 and its iterations as the best of all time, simply due to the fact that it sold the most copies and still remains the most played fighting game right up until this day. The best to me is all about impact, and Street Fighter 2 has made a bigger impact than any other fighting game. In summary, is Marvel vs. Capcom 2 the greatest fighter of all time? Well, it depends on your perspective, but a case for it is certainly plausible, which to me makes the overall over-analysis of this title entirely worth it. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is simply one of the greatest sprite-based fighting games of all time, and its chaotic nature, huge roster, and 3-on-3 fighting mechanics would always make it a difficult game to top. Sadly though, in the events following the release of this game, Capcom would run into legal issues with Marvel that would put the series on hiatus for nearly a decade, but would continue their run of quality with the Capcom vs SNK games, another ambitious tag team crossover series with the second entry also going on to become one of the apex titles of the 2D sprite-based fighting game era. Aside from this though, not all was rosy when it came to Capcom's fighting titles. Street Fighter 3 and its iterations had been a commercial failure. Street Fighter EX3 had been completely overshadowed and outsold by Tekken Tag Tournament. Capcom's 3D crossover game Capcom Fighting All-Stars was cancelled due to quality issues, and Capcom's sprite-based fighting game Capcom Fighting Evolution sold poorly and was panned by fans and critics alike. Over a course of years, Capcom fighting games had slowly lost their momentum, and for this reason for a few good years the company chose to shy away from the genre, making chances of a Marvel vs. Capcom 3 increasingly less and less likely. Despite all of this, a fighting game renaissance would eventually come for the company, ironically from Street Fighter 2, the game that had previously led to an arcade renaissance, in an era where the arcade was considered to be slowly dying. This source of popularity would arrive with the release of Street Fighter 2 on Xbox Live, leading to huge sales numbers as fans nostalgically clawed to play this all-time classic using their modern hardware. This would spark Capcom executive Inafune to greenlight the development of Street Fighter 4, a modern game that was designed to lead the new generation of fighting games while simultaneously cashing in on Street Fighter 2 nostalgia by heavily leaning on the Street Fighter 2 cast and offering very similar gameplay mechanics. In tandem to this, Capcom had also been offered to use Tatsunoko characters in one of their titles, intellectual properties belonging to a Japanese animation company. This would lead to the Wii fighting game Tatsunoko vs Capcom, a new crossover fighting game that was developed simultaneously at the same time as Street Fighter 4. Street Fighter 4 and Tatsunoko vs Capcom were both commercial and critical successes, which Capcom put partially down to their new game design choices. Both of these games featured more simplistic scaled-back controls than that of most of the last sprite-based fighting games the company had created prior. These had resulted in poor sales and had largely only been appreciated by the hardcore fighting game community members. Street Fighter 4 and Tatsunoko vs Capcom brought fighting games back to the mainstream, which would in turn mean lots more Capcom fighting games would be soon to follow. During this period, Capcom would finally acquire a new license to develop a new game using Marvel characters. This title was first publicly announced at Capcom's Captivate Press show in Hawaii in April 2010. But the company had apparently already been working on the title since 2008, the same year as Street Fighter 4 and Tatsunoko vs Capcom originally released. Ryoto Nitsuma was tasked to head the project, the same man who had found success when he headed production of Tatsunoko vs Capcom. Nitsuma was ecstatic to lead a project that had seen years and years of unrelenting fan demand to be created and to bring this product to life. He would state that the game was to be built using an MT framework game engine, the same one used to create Resident Evil 4 and Lost Planet 2. The design philosophy for such a title would fall much in line with the already successful Street Fighter 4 and Tatsunoko vs Capcom games, essentially all games that were designed to maximise gameplay depth and minimise complexity. Street Fighter 4 had expanded the Street Fighter user base, so Nitsuma felt that this line of thinking would result in growing the Marvel vs Capcom fanbase in much of the same way. In fact, he argued that this was even more important with this game, as it was a great opportunity to draw in Marvel fans who were perhaps not familiar with fighting games at all. Marvel vs Capcom 3 arguably presented Capcom with one of their biggest opportunities yet, as this was a period in time after the Marvel brand had seen huge success in Hollywood, giving the game a level of marketing appeal not seen with any of the earlier Marvel vs Capcom games. Capcom's global head of production, Keiji Inafune, was rubbing his hands together at the prospect of releasing a game that could appeal to such a wide audience. The game's development would see the company opt for a simple control scheme similar to Tatsunoko vs Capcom, and the addition of Simple Mode, which we shall get to discussing later. In a first for the company, Capcom would also not bother to plan a release for this game in the arcades at all, and instead this time around attempt to appeal solely to the casual market gaming on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360s at home. During the game's development cycle, Capcom's art design team would work extremely closely alongside Marvel comic employees to ensure that all characters in the game were properly artistically represented. This would mean that all characters featured in the game would be modelled after their most recent comic book appearances, leading to many characters looking quite different from their previous Capcom vs series appearances. In terms of authenticity, this would also lead to Nitsuma getting rid of the Japanese voice actors for Marvel characters, as he felt that having those characters speak a language other than English did not mesh well with those characters' images. The game, developed by Capcom in a collaborative effort with 18, would finally see release in February 2011, a whole 11 years since the release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2. This long-awaited game would see a simultaneous release on both the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, two consoles that seemed perfect homes for the game. In terms of the game itself, the title massively differs artistically from the previous Marvel vs. Capcom games. The game instead takes the same sort of graphical approach as Street Fighter 4 and Tatsunoko vs. Capcom, in that the fights in the title take place on 2D planes, but 2D sprites are dropped in favour of 3-dimensional character models. Combat in this game, like in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 of old, takes place between teams of 3 taking on teams of 3, meaning that after 11 long years, Teddy Long could breathe a sigh of relief, as 6-man tag team action lived to fight another day. Holla holla holla! In these tag team matches, players can switch between their 3 selected players at will and can call upon each of them during matches. Like in some previous MVC games, during contests players also have the ability to call on their off-screen characters to perform single special moves known as assists, which adds to the game's in-game strategy when experiencing this title. Further from this, as characters both receive and deal damage, their team's overall hyper combo gauge gradually fills up with energy, which can be used to execute a variety of different techniques. Like in many Capcom fighting games, this includes hyper combos, and like previous MVC games, once again, snapbacks are executable, which force your opponent's character to tag out against their will. Crossover combination moves are also executable within this game, techniques which utilise a player's whole team to use all of their hyper combos simultaneously in one huge powerful attack. In addition to all of this, the game features a completely new mechanic known as X Factor, which for a short time allows players to increase damage they can inflict. They also have faster speed during this time frame and the ability to regenerate health. X Factors can be activated by a player once per match and can be used within extended combos. The power and endurance of an X Factor depends on how many fighters a team has left. The more damaged the team is, the greater the power of the move, making it somewhat of a desperation attack. Like the majority of fighting games, players must use the moves available at their disposal to deplete their opponent's life bars. In most circumstances, victory is achieved when all 3 members of an opposing team have been knocked out. However, in some cases a winner is decided when the time limit runs out based on who has the most accumulative health remaining. Simple fighting game stuff really. As mentioned earlier in the video, to fall in line with Capcom's modern approach and to appeal to the huge casual market the Hollywood film industry had generated for the Marvel Universe, the controls within Marvel vs. Capcom 2 were scaled back for Marvel vs. Capcom 3 to try and give the game a wider appeal than simply fighting game community diehards. This simplification process had actually been taking place for a while anyway, with the early Marvel vs. Capcom games such as Xmen vs. Street Fighter offering a 6-button control scheme back in 1996. This would be simplified to a 4-button scheme for Marvel vs. Capcom 2 in the year 2000. Marvel vs. Capcom 3, a further 11 years later, would go one step further, offering only a 3-button control scheme, much like Tatsunoko vs. Capcom that had been released 2 years earlier. The 3-button scheme offered undefined light, medium and hard attacks, whereas in the earlier 6-button games, players had these options but could choose between punches and kicks. To quote Nitsuma on this more modern approach, he stated that this was to knock down the wall of complicated controls and open up a field of strategic fighting to all comers. Amusingly, if this simplified gameplay was not enough, Nitsuma would go one step even further with this one, introducing a simple mode, which we briefly mentioned earlier. Simple mode was designed for gamers who had never played a fighting game in their lifetime, who simply procured the game due to their interest in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Simple mode is a style of play that allows players to perform special moves and hyper combos with just single button presses, at the expense of limiting a character's available moveset. Keeping all of this in mind, if the developers made the effort to create an entire gameplay mode for gamers who did not care for fighting games, which changes the whole way the game plays, it begs the question really why they never just stuck a 6-button hardcore mode in too. But enough about this tangent for now, as there is plenty more to cover on controls later in the video. For now, let's discuss the game's fighting roster, one of the most distinguishing features of this title. As mentioned earlier in this video, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 offered a whopping 56 characters. The original version of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, on the other hand, features a more slimmed down 36 characters. Speaking of this character lineup, as mentioned previously, Marvel gave Nitsuma's team direction when it came to the many character designs. However, all of the game's balancing was left down to Capcom. So Nitsuma and Co.'s duty was to preserve the Marvel characters' essence from the source material, while simultaneously shaping them as interesting fighting game characters. What may come as a surprise to some regarding the game's roster, whilst MVC2 had that huge roster of 56 characters, only 14 of those would resurface as playable characters in the original incarnation of Marvel vs. Capcom 3, thus meaning the 22 other characters are completely new to this fighting game franchise. Often in these videos I run through every new addition, but considering this game has such an array of new characters, I'll just let the gameplay footage do most of the talking. Many of the characters in Marvel vs. Capcom 3, particularly on the Capcom side of things, are modern gaming characters, many of which did not even exist when Xmen vs. Street Fighte was released back in 1996. But what I will do is touch on a few of my favourite additions to the roster. Whilst also appearing in Saturday Night Slam Masters prior to the release of this game, this was Haga of Final Fight fame's first appearance as a playable fighter within a Capcom vs series game. A fighter whose appearance was long overdue in my opinion. Dante from Devil May Cry is also playable, a fighter who had grown to superstar status in between the release of this title and Marvel vs. Capcom 2 back in the day. It would be criminal not to include him within this game. Other interesting additions include Chris Redfield from Resident Evil and Beautiful Joe from Beautiful Joe, a character whose inclusion is perfect considering that he too is a superhero. Arthur of Ghosts and Goblins fame is also another fun addition to this roster. There are lots of fun additions on the Marvel side of things too, but the biggest of these debuts has to go to Deadpool. Deadpool, by Marvel standards, is a fairly new character, debuting in the New Mutant. Today, the fourth wall-breaking character is right up there with Spider-Man as one of the most popular superheroes on the planet. So his inclusion in this game is an extremely welcome one, and probably the most memorable and iconic addition to the whole Marvel vs. Capcom 3 roster. MVC3 was also the first Marvel vs. Capcom title to offer DLC, expanding the roster up to 38 characters if players were willing to download Jill Valentine and Shuma Gorath. DLC costume packs also existed, containing new outfits for Ryu, Thor, Dante, Iron Man, Chris Redfield and Captain America. In terms of play modes, MVC3 features an arcade mode, which offers players exactly what you would expect, in that it offers a series of matches against various AI-controlled teams of 3, followed up with a final boss fight in a traditional fashion. The final boss encounter of this game takes place against Galactus, a supervillain from the Fantastic Four comic book series. Beating arcade mode with each player rewards the player with a different ending. There is also a local 2-player versus mode, a training mode, and a mission mode which offers characters specific challenges. Arguably, most importantly, and in line with the modern era of gaming, the title featured online play utilising Xbox Live and PlayStation Network services, essentially offering up endless multiplayer replayability for those who are that way inclined. So now, that is pretty much Marvel vs. Capcom 3 in a nutshell, so let us take some time to see how this game was received on release. GameSpot would praise the title, stating, "This venerable fighting series, renowned for its structured insanity, has finally returned with the same fire and intensity that was its hallmark. The game's core combat mechanics have been simplified and work harmoniously to drive you and the action forward. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is a blast to play, despite losing some of the higher level intricacies found in its predecessor. It's an exceptional synthesis of cohesion and chaos, and shows real improvement over its predecessor." IGN would add to the conversation by stating, "This third entry in the MVC series attempts to be the same addicting game as its predecessor. The core mechanics for Marvel vs. Capcom 3 are at once fantastic, familiar, and alien. Ultimately, the alterations help mature the franchise, removing needless complexity. The game has enough depth as it is. This game isn't perfect, but it got the most important elements right. However, this raises the question of quality versus quantity. Compared with Marvel vs. Capcom 2, we've lost 20 characters. Does the balance and diversity of this group compensate for that loss? In some ways it does. There is something very refreshing about seeing unconventional and original fighting archetypes enter a franchise this established. And yet it's undeniably disappointing that many favourites like Mega Man or Venom are nowhere to be seen. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 doesn't disappoint as a fighting game, even after a decade of waiting. It is very much the same insane concept we know and love, which isn't a bad thing. By drastically revising the roster, what's old is definitely new again. All in all, the game was universally praised, with the game receiving multiple awards. At the Electronic Entertainment Expo, it would get the Best Fighting Game award. It also earned Best Fighting Games of E3 awards from IGN, 1UP.com and X-Play. From critic sources at the time, the only real criticism seemed to rise from the game's lack of online play features, with the game not offering the same depth in this regard than that of Street Fighte 4. Eurogamer pointed specifically to the absence of spectator mode, noting that the exclusion of viewable matches also presented a serious shortcoming in the title. Overall though, critics were very happy with the experience that Marvel vs. Capcom 3 presented. However, 9 years removed from the release of this title, I can see why this game doesn't seem to be as revered as some of the earlier Capcom vs. fighting games. The simplified control scheme is less appealing overall to more seasoned fighting game enthusiasts, and for me personally, and perhaps many other gamers, the game's 3D character models lack the same charm as 2D animated sprites. I mean, the game features freaking comic book characters for crying out loud. They were all designed to be appreciated in 2D. However, I guess some will probably disagree with me, bearing in mind the success Marvel has had in Hollywood. Personally though, I have never been on that bandwagon. Still though, taking all of the game's predecessors out of the equation, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is a game that was perfect for the time period it was born into, and as a result would sell 2 million freaking copies to fans around the globe. The success of the game would lead to the release of Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, a game I will perhaps do a standalone video on down the line. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is an updated version of this title that features largely identical gameplay mechanics to the original, with changes made to both the aerial combat and X-Factor systems. The biggest change to this game though was the inclusion of 12 more fighters, expanding the roster all the way up to 50 fighters, presenting players with a fairly substantial upgrade and certainly the best version of the game to play. But all in all, it is still the same game. To conclude this video, it is still up for debate whether Marvel vs. Capcom 3 delivered a superior sequel to that of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, and many old school fans of the franchise would certainly disagree in that regard. One fact, however, cannot be argued with, and that is that Capcom managed to produce something extremely different from the last entry in the series, and a game that overall did a fantastic job of creating a game that appealed to the casual gaming market. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is a polarising game in 2020 that has its fair share of both fans and detractors for completely justifiable reasons. All of these elements combine to make the title an extremely interesting one within fighting game history, and certainly far from the franchise's lowest point, which sadly I will soon be covering on here. Yeah! The Marvel vs. Capcom series pretty much started out as a Street Fighter spin-off, with the first entry in the whole series being Xmen vs. Street Fighter. This meant that previously the roster in every title had been very Street Fighter heavy, which made perfect sense considering this was a fighting game franchise. Marvel vs. Capcom 3, Fate of Two Worlds on the other hand had very few Street Fighter characters, and most of the roster chosen for this game by Capcom were not from fighting games at all. It seems strange that you could not play as Ken in this game, but you could play as the likes of Chris Redfield. The roster was smaller than Marvel vs. Capcom 2, with a base of only 36 fighters. Many involved did not exactly scream fighting games either, which as a result would lead to many people finding the game less appealing. Despite the game's flaws, there was still a lot to be appreciated about Marvel vs. Capcom 3, and Capcom were planning to expand on the game further by increasing the game's roster via the implementation of DLC, a feature that would not have even been possible during the days of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, so there was an interesting future ahead for the already critically acclaimed title. Development on DLC would take place throughout 2011, however an event would occur that would shake the very foundations of this process, ultimately resulting in most of the DLC being cancelled, with the exception of the ability to download players like Jill Valentine, Shu Gorath, and a few costume packs. Basically, development would be interrupted by Japan being hit with the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, an undersea mega-thrust earthquake off the coast of Japan that occurred on Friday the 11th of March 2011. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan, and the fourth most powerful earthquake in the world since modern record keeping began in 1900. The chaos these events would inflict on the nation of Japan would massively disrupt the development cycle of the downloadable content. However, as is often the case, destruction births creativity, and as a result the delayed additional content would be fleshed out further to create an additional standalone title that would retail at a discounted rate from that of the original. This new game, titled Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, would hit shelves at the tail end of 2011 and would obviously feature a number of changes to differentiate it from what came before it. At the game's heart, the ultimate version of this game is still very much Marvel vs. Capcom 3. The arcade fighting style remains largely the same, as does the game's 6-person tag team mechanics, along with the character's assists, special moves and hyper combos. All of these features make a welcome return. Holla holla holla! Instantly, people who have played both versions will notice some aesthetic changes. For example, the character and stage selection screens have been completely redesigned. In fact, there are a lot of small changes and details, some of which we shall cover. However, the game's most striking new feature is a largely expanded character roster, which is probably the main feature that would have inspired some consumers to buy Marvel vs. Capcom 3 again so quickly. Being a Marvel vs. Capcom game, the title offers a balanced selection of new fighters coming from each entity, 6 from Marvel and 6 from Capcom, offering consumers a whopping new 12 characters to choose from, as many characters as what are in Street Fighter 2 to begin with, so a decent amount. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that the character selection in Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was probably not as strong as the second entry, and once again, as is true to the rest of the game. These 12 new fighters have a fair amount of obscure characters included within them, so let's quickly cover the new additions to the lineup. First, on the Capcom side of things, we have Strider Heryu, a character who was in the older Marvel vs. Capcom games, but was not included in the earlier version of Marvel vs. Capcom 3. This character from the Strider series makes his return to the MVC franchise here. Bizarrely, whilst Ken from Street Fighter 2 is not selectable, players can now play as Phoenix Bloody Right from Ace Attorney, as nothing says hard bastard like a suit-wearing rookie defense attorney. At least we can't accuse Capcom of being unimaginative with their roster. Virgil makes his debut in this game, and he is more pissed off than ever after no one went to visit his stand after that convention. As great as it would be to see the real version of Virgil in this game, sadly it's just a Virgil from Devil May Cry. At least this character fights, I suppose. Frank West from Dead Rising also makes his MVC debut here, after already appearing in Tatsunoko vs. Capcom at an earlier date. And Nemesis T-Type from Resident Evil 3 also makes their fighting game debut here. To round off the Capcom offerings, finally we have Firebrand, originally from the Ghost and Goblin series, who would go on to receive their own spin-off series down the line known as Gargoyle Quest, at least a more intimidating fighter than the likes of Arthur. On the Marvel side, we have Doctor Strange, who I was familiar with in my childhood due to watching the Fox Kids Spider-Man cartoon. We have Ghost Rider, who I suppose was topical at the time of the game's release, bearing in mind the character was portrayed in a movie that year by Nicolas Cage, Hawkeye, a member of the Avengers who had appeared in a Thor movie that year, Iron Fist, a user of martial arts and the wielder of a mystical force, Nova, a member of the intergalactic police force known as the Nova Corps, and Rocket Raccoon, who was an extremely prominent member in the 2008 relaunch of the superhero team Guardians of the Galaxy. Maybe it's me being an old man, but even with the new additions to the Marvel vs. Capcom 3 roster, I massively prefer the characters who were in Marvel vs. Capcom 2. It seems like most of the roster chosen for the Marvel vs. Capcom 3 games were chosen for product placement purposes, with the hope of promoting modern movies and games, rather than trying to focus on characters with charm and actual lasting appeal. In fact, after drawing these inferences whilst producing this video, I soon learned, according to Seth Killian, a former community manager at Capcom, that Capcom's bizarre character offerings were introduced to bring combat diversity to the game. For example, Capcom wanted a monster-like character that could fight whilst in the air, which is why Firebrand was introduced. Most of the new Marvel characters, on the other hand, were simply chosen for the game to cross-promote upcoming products, much like what I suspected in the first place, which is why I gather they lack a bit of soul. According to Capcom, many new features and refinements were the result of fan feedback from the Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Fate of the Two Worlds game. In terms of these refinements, combat mechanics were tweaked. For example, combat was made more balanced and the X Factor mechanic has been adjusted so that characters can use it whilst airborne instead of just on the ground. X Factors grant players with an increased damage output, speed and health regeneration for a limited time during combat. The game's aerial exchange feature was also tinkered with so that players can either remove a meter from their opponent's hyper combo gauge, add a meter to their own gauge, or simply deal more damage, mixing things up slightly. In addition to the game's previous installments play modes, in the ultimate version of the game there was also new play modes added too, and a feature known as Heroes Herald, which was a free downloadable. This was a mode where players could earn new abilities, customise their characters with new powers, and compete in factions as either the heroes defending Earth or as one of Galactus' heralds. New abilities were gained in this play mode by collecting what was known as ability cards, which feature various characters from the Marvel and Capcom universes. Up to 3 of these different cards could be equipped at once, with over 100 existing to collect. A new offline mode was included too, known as Galactus Mode, allowing players to fight as Galactus against AI-controlled opponents, which added a little more variety to the experience. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 also provided smoother online play than that of Fatal for Two Worlds, which was possible due to the second version of the game offering an optimised netcode. A spectator mode was included too to allow up to 6 players to watch online matches, and rematches and leaderboard functionality was added to the game as well. IGN would cover the release of this game, stating that the previous Marvel vs. Capcom 3 game was a great fighter that pushed the series forward in many ways, but drew criticism for a lack of modes and a smaller fighter roster than its predecessors. They also said, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 makes all the customary moves for a Capcom update, bringing in new fighters, new stages and a few additional features while retaining the crazy sense of style that gives the series distinction in the fighting game genre. The new changes will be great for hardcore fans of the franchise. The inclusion of the new characters is definitely a welcome addition that rectifies one of the main issues with Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but the game is still pretty light on new modes. Graphically, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 has the same stylish look as Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which is great. What the characters lack in detail, they make up for in personality, and the brightly coloured and intense special effects give the game a unique sense of style and a near seizure-inducing visual pop and flair. The crazy characters and insane special combos and moves make Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 a visual treat that stands alone against other fighters out there. As you can see, IGN loved Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but what did others think? GameSpot would state, Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 introduces a host of unique characters and gameplay tweaks that change the game's formula for the better. They would be a little more critical than IGN though, summarising that, ultimately, Ultimate is still a monster hiding under an attractive coat of flashy combos and familiar characters. It may feel inviting at first, but sink a little deeper and you discover a game in which victory and defeat hinge on a fine line. It's a high risk, high reward system that buries you in a brightly coloured light show on the slightest misstep. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is unquestionably the superior version, and while its feature set still feels lacking compared to other available fighters, the series' unique blend of structured insanity remains strong. Whilst a previous version of the game had appeared on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, Ultimate marked the first Marvel vs. Capcom game in the franchise to be released on a handheld. A full console version of the game would arrive on the PlayStation Vita, which received heavy praise for its technical performance, visual fidelity and faithfulness to the home console counterparts. Now, as mentioned earlier in the video, this would be a game that would end up disappearing. Basically, after being on the market less than 2 years, the game would be removed from online stores due to an apparent expiration on the Marvel contract Capcom held. It soon transpired that the key reasoning behind the events that had unfolded was due to Marvel owners Walt Disney choosing to stop Capcom from licensing the game rather than renewing it as originally intended. Disney's reasoning for this was that they wanted to optimise the Marvel IPs exclusively in their own games, their self-published Disney Infinity series, which, to put it simply, was kind of a shameless rip-off of Skylanders. The same stunt that Nintendo would shamelessly pull off too, when they would release the Amiibo range. Like Nintendo, Disney could smell money here, and Marvel figurines would make perfect little collectibles. As great as this plan would sound on paper though, it would ultimately result in a huge business blunder for Disney, as 3 years later, on March 10th, 2016, Disney would end their Infinity line, declaring the product line over due to a lack of growth in the toys to life market and increasing developmental costs. They would even close down Avalanche Software and Disney Interactive Studios as a whole. Showing as wealthy as the company that they were not good at self-publishing their own video games. In fact, it would not be too long at all before Disney would realise that they could not really cut it as a game publisher, so would go back to the old method of outsourcing their licenses to developers and publishers with experience in the field, who actually knew what they were doing. So by the end of that same year, something amazing would happen. That would be music to the ears of Marvel vs. Capcom fans. At a Sony Playstation Experience press conference, it would be announced that not only was Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 going to once again become available in digital stores, but Disney had also given Capcom the licensing rights to create an all-new game known as Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which was set for release in 2017. Marvel vs. Capcom was officially back. The new project was to be directed by Nori Maru, a man who worked as a programmer of the series since Xmen vs. Street Fighte back in 1996. The development of this title would be split between several different parties, with Capcom of Japan, Capcom USA and Marvel Games themselves all playing an active role. The concept which they intended to deliver on was to create a game which was both complex and hardcore like traditional fighting games of old, but to also be a game that was more elegant and simplified than many created in the past. You may notice straight away that these factors are arguably paradoxical to one another, but I guess what they really meant was they simply just wanted to create a game that could appeal to as wide a market as possible. So overall, the aim was to create a Marvel vs. Capcom game that kept core elements intact, such as air combos for example, but at the same time they wanted to deliver something fresh, which is even easier to pick up and play than before. I have noted in the past how games such as Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 were already much more simplistic than games that came before them, with the entries in the Street Fighter 3 series being prime examples of more complex fighters. These sort of games did not sell well on release due to not appealing strong enough to the casual market, a problem that later titles would rectify, offering the more simplified approach. These games sold very well, so it is no surprise really that Capcom intended to double down even further on simplicity. Further to this, there was an even larger casual market for Marvel characters than there was before, as the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe had put the brand in an entire different stratosphere to its place in the world from where it was back in 1996, with the release of Xmen vs. Street Fighte. Superheroes were mainstream and legitimately cool in this period. Now, there is a lot to get through with regards to what Capcom & Co did to attempt to make an even more simplistic game than the likes of MVC3. So let's go through the many elements that make up this final instalment in the series. A producer working on the project known as Mark Evans states that Capcom analysed that many people who had played the last entry in the series viewed the game as way too overwhelming, with just far too much going on. For this reason, to make the game more accessible to everyone, the series' famed 3-on-3 battle system would be completely phased out and replaced with more simplistic 2-on-2 battles. As you can imagine, the axing of the 6-man tag action was hugely disappointing to many fans of the series. Previously, the games had always been championed for including more and more elements, and the 3-on-3 tag-in tag-out bouts was one of the key features as to why Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was so loved in the first place. Further to this, the previous game's chaotic nature was a staple of the series that set it apart from other games in the same genre. So this move not only seemed to be diluting the franchise to bring it more in line with other fighters, but customers would also feel cheated, having elements removed from a game rather than being added. It kind of reminds me of the release of Pokemon Sword and Shield last year. Further from this, the reduction of fighters in each match was not the only feature that would be removed from combat. As to quote Capcom, things would be streamlined further. A previous feature of the series was to call in other characters to perform assist moves. This was completely taken out of the game and instead replaced with a new feature involving the Infinity Stones. To put it simply, these 6 Infinity Stones can be loosely compared to the grooves in the Capcom vs SNK games, offering players slightly different fighting game mechanics. Although, rather than being placed in the game to present players with further customization, it seems as though they were mainly featured in order to further level the playing field in matches. The Infinity Stone's main purpose functions as a comeback enabler, compensating for losing characters' deficiencies by enhancing their strong points. As we know, there are a lot of marketing reasons why the name Infinite was used for the title, but obviously the Infinity Stones further tie into this theme, with one developer stating the goal was for the stones to present players with infinite gameplay possibilities. Like previous entries, the Hyper Combo gauge is featured within the game, that gradually fills up as characters deal and receive damage. Filling this up allows players to perform traditional hyper combos, but now a move called a counter switch is also executable. A counter switch lets characters tag out instantly, even whilst an opponent is attacking them, allowing combos to be broken more simply than previously by allowing for easy counter-attack opportunities. What may come as a surprise to some is that Capcom chose to return to the old 4 attack button layout, which had not been seen since much earlier entries in the series, which must be one of the features included what Capcom were referring to when they said that they wanted the game in some aspects to feel like games of old. This does not particularly damage the game's accessibility though, which seems to be the main angle Capcom really wanted to push, due to the fact that combos in this game are performable simply by tapping the light punch button, both on the ground and in the air, meaning in theory even a 3-year-old could perform combos in this game. Even hyper combos were made executable by just pressing the 2 heavy attack buttons at once. So that's the basic mechanical changes to the game, but as you know there are more factors that made Marvel vs Capcom so popular in the past than simply just the combat system. So despite the fighting mechanics themselves being gimped, does this game at least bring a charming innovative roster to the table? Let's discuss. So in the past, it seems each entry seemed to bring some kind of cool gimmick to the roster, with each passing entry. The first game lets us play as both Xmen and Street Fighte characters, the second game gave us other Marvel fighters to play as, the next one gave us new characters on the Capcom side of things, the fourth entry gave us a gigantic roster, and the fifth game ended up giving us a large roster too, this time made up of plenty of complete new fighters. They all brought us something different. So did Marvel vs Capcom Infinite provide us with an infinite amount of fighters to choose from? Well, obviously, absolutely not. Marvel vs Capcom 2 gave us 56 fighters, Ultimate Marvel vs Capcom gave us 48, whereas Marvel vs Capcom Infinite shortchanged gamers by giving us a launch lineup roster selection of only 30 different characters, which was a huge step backwards, but I guess at least it falls in line with Capcom's aim at the time to simplify things. Reducing consumer choices seems to have been one of their methods in achieving such a feat. To make matters even worse, out of the 30 characters who were chosen for the game, only 5 of those were new to the franchise, with the rest returning from previous games. On the Capcom side of things, we received X as a playable fighter, the lead character from Mega Man X, and Jeddah, the final boss from Darkstalkers 3. In terms of Marvel characters, the newbies would include Gamora from Guardians of the Galaxy, along with Ultron from the Avengers series, and Captain Marvel. Apart from wanting to simplify things, I personally feel that Capcom intentionally limited the lineup in order to encourage players to fork out even more money for the game's DLC characters. 6 characters who should have been in the game in my opinion from day one anyway, as 36 fighters was still a small number by the modern era's standards. So if you did not feel that paying for a game once was enough, you could download Black Panther, Black Widow, The Winter Soldier, Sigma, Monster Hunter and even bloody Venom, a character who was free in previous games, making this concept even more frustrating. Apart from making gamers pay an additional fee to add content to this game that should have been there in the first place, an element that made all of this even more annoying was that many of the beloved fighters were left out of this game. Most notably, the majority of characters from the Street Fighte franchise, and even more alarmingly, the game features not one single character from the Xmen, the franchise that was key in making this crossover series so popular in the first place 21 years prior. Reportedly, when it comes to the game's character roster, in terms of the characters featured, it is said that Marvel Studios called many of the shots, prioritising characters based on how important they were to their cinematic universe at that exact moment in time. So characters were chosen based on how important they were to Disney based on product placement over that period. In terms of movie licensing, despite Disney owning Marvel Studios, in 2017 Fox held the movie rights to the X-Men franchise. From what I can tell, there is absolutely no reason that the entire X-Men lineup were left out of this game other than the fact that Disney could not use them to promote their movies, so bitterly left them out of the game, which is meant to celebrate the best characters Marvel has to offer. Hilariously, Capcom producer Michael Evans attempted to justify this greedy corporate nonsense by giving an entirely different excuse, stating, "We talked with Marvel very closely about their future roadmap, about what's going to be happening. Your modern Marvel fan, maybe they don't even remember some of the X-Men characters, but they know some of the Guardian characters or Black Panther. You know what I mean? Captain Marvel may seem like a strange pick, but she's fantastic. She fits the gameplay, she fits the story, and they're going to be really pushing her as a strong female lead all the way up into the movie. We're trying to take everything into account and choose the best characters. So yeah, according to one of the most important people who worked on this project, people apparently don't know who the X-Men are anymore. I would be curious to hear your thoughts down below whether you think there is any truth to this. As for me personally, it is one of the first Marvel franchises I think of when someone says Marvel to me. Hilariously, Evans even doubled down on his opinion by trying to claim X-Men characters in previous entries were only popular due to their function, rather than their likability as fleshed out characters within comic book culture. He states, if you were to actually think about it, these characters are just functions. They're just doing things. Magneto, case in point, is a favourite because he has 8-way dash and he's really fast, right? So our most technical players, all they want to do is triangle jump and that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? Nova can do the same thing, Captain Marvel can do the same thing, Ultron can do the same thing. Go ahead and try them out. All in all, I have to say, I find Evans' gymnastics absolutely hilarious with regards to trying to justify as to why there were no X-Men included in this bloody game. I understand that it would probably not be a good look, admitting that X-Men were left out of the game because Disney were not allowed to make an X-Men movie at the time, but trying to claim they are not popular characters is just plain stupid and insulting. So we have scoured back fighting mechanics, a puny roster missing some of the most popular Marvel characters of all time, but what about play modes, eh? What did the game have to offer in that department? Well, around this time frame, Capcom were not strangers to criticism and had made blunders with their fighting games prior to this one. Street Fighte V came under harsh criticism due to the amount of content available in the game being quite frankly abhorrent on release, and server issues delivered a poor online multiplayer experience in the early days too. So Capcom were looking to at least deliver better on features like this with Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, so that they could right some of their wrongs. This would mean that Infinite would feature many standard fighting game play modes, something that somehow Street Fighter V had managed to lack. But on top of that too, the game would feature an all-new play mode set to heavily target that huge diverse audience and casual players who tend to enjoy the now huge Marvel Cinematic Universe. In fact, with regards to touching on this, something I have not at all mentioned yet, which you would have at least noticed plenty of times in this video, is the game's new cinematic graphical style. This differed from the previous entry in the series. Marvel vs. Capcom 3 featured characters who looked like they were 3D models based on how characters were drawn in Marvel comic books. This game features a more realistic look to fall further in line with these new money-spinning movies. Capcom were really hoping to hook into the market who love these films, which is where a new play mode comes in, known as Infinite Story Mode. This is a 2-hour cinematic story campaign featuring story cutscenes and dialogue. The cheesy story ties all of the characters from the game into one cohesive narrative, which kind of reminds me of the subspace emissary that was featured in Super Smash Bros. Brawl a decade prior. The story delivers cringe-worthy one-liners, delivered almost entirely without charm. But at least it is something new for the franchise, if we are going to draw any positives at all here. Reading various reviews that were published around this game's release, review scores seem to be average, with a mix of praise and criticism being presented by journalists at the time, with many being disappointed due to many faults we have already gone over, whilst many were impressed with the game's Infinity Stone system, with publications such as IGN noting that it is the highlight of the game. Speaking of IGN, they were particularly disgusted with the game's story and roster, stating, "Its story is dreadful, and its characters look like they were deliberately designed to spawn a million derpy memes." As discussed previously, the goal for Capcom with this one was to create a game with simplified play mechanics that would appeal to a gigantic market who watch Marvel movies. Capcom were unfortunately not capable of pulling this feat off, as the game would massively underperform commercially, even putting off many members of the already established Marvel vs. Capcom game franchise. Capcom were extremely confident that this game would shift a bare minimum of 2 million units, with the hope of selling much more if they got things right. The game never even got close to its sales target though, only selling around 1 million copies, and when you consider the popularity of the MCU, that's a bit embarrassing really. Within Capcom's 2018 integrated report, Capcom described sales for Infinite as weak, stating Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite delivered a certain level of sales, primarily overseas owing to deep-rooted popularity, but underperformed overall. Considering the commercial failings of this game, I see it as highly unlikely that there will ever be another Marvel vs. Capcom game. But which party is most to blame with regards to all of this? Can we credit Disney with being the entity who destroyed this franchise? Well, personally, I would place blame equally on both parties. Both failed in delivering an experience worthy of the Marvel vs. Capcom brand. Disney should certainly be held accountable for depriving long-term fans the ability to play as for Xmen. The Xmen, along with the cast of Street Fighter, are the very reason this crossover formula started, so to exclude them from this game is frankly ridiculous, even if Disney were not releasing any movies featuring the X-Men at the time. Blatant corporate greed has never been more transparent than it is when looking at Marvel vs. Capcom Infinity's roster. In fact, greed seems to be the running theme that looks to have destroyed any chances of this game becoming an all-time great. Capcom intentionally nuked most of the intricacies, six-man action, and chaos that made this franchise so popular in the first place. They threw away most of what fans enjoyed and were familiar with, simply to try and cater to a larger market who would ultimately ignore that this game even existed. Their greed would mean that they would satisfy no one. And don't even get me started on charging $30 to download 6 characters to a minuscule roster of just 30. Considering now that Disney now own Marvel and that Capcom seem to have become obsessed with turning profit through DLC and microtransactions, I am kind of glad that Marvel vs. Capcom games seem to be dead. With the way both Disney and Capcom operate currently, it would be unlikely that they would ever be capable of releasing another decent Marvel vs. Capcom game, even if all the licensing was ironed out to be made possible. So, to summarise, Disney certainly contributed to destroying Marvel vs. Capcom, but Capcom seemed to play their equal role in the affairs too. Despite the death of a once great franchise, all is not lost, as we still have all the great games from the series to go back and play. Games from a time period when Capcom were making games to simply deliver the best experience possible, rather than trying to appeal to markets that simply were not really there, and trying to fleece the consumer through microtransactions. So, I guess, ladies and gentlemen, I've finally finished telling the mad story of every Capcom vs. game. Everything they did with Marvel, everything they did with SNK, and even with Tatsunoko. It has taken me nearly a year to make videos covering this whole subject. But I must say, I feel great to have finished telling the entirety of this narrative. So, whatever will I do next, ladies and gentlemen? Street Fighter Cross Tekken maybe? Let me know in the comment section down below. If you enjoyed this video, I have dozens on my channel for you to check out, covering all sorts of aspects of gaming history. So why not go check out some of the older content? These videos are mostly funded by the fantastic people who back this channel over on Patreon. So if you want to help out and play an even more active role in my community, why not check out the backer incentives? Additional shoutouts and thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, Heo Paula Lopez, Joseph Rasmick, Doug Perkins, The Murder of Crows, Ego, Alethea Swanson, Angel Light 85, Asobi Kwang DX, Azrael Rorikai, Brian Barry, Camber Amber 82, Carlos Domingos, Computer Man, Daniel Daly, ECU Professor, Evan Balder, Gary Pinkett, Gianni V. Santisi, Glenny Glenn, Hamid Musa, House of Pated, Dropkin Varela, Jordan Durant, Keith Ferguson, Lars Sonderfin, Matthew Robinson, Michael Cullick, Nick Daniels, Philip Manth, Prince Knight, Princess Zana, Smudge McBee, Timothy W. Haskins II, TOG Driver, St. Spaces, Adam Castin, Adrian Hannington, Anders Reinsbergs, Andrew Bazansky, Andrew Pearson, Angry Little SOB, Antonio Rodriguez, Bernard NG, Bubba Kitty, Chris Fisk, Chris Margarine, Chris Cool, Craig Jenkins, Crazy Yarl, Dan Barlow Jr., Dan Van Dam, David Bell, Francesco Lacriola, Gregory Sonmoreji Risk, Hans Christian, Ivan M, James Bishop, James McDonald, JB, Jesse Tay, Joel, John Bates, Kings Knight, Langston Miller, Lobster Puncher, Lewis Viant, Luke Canava, Marco Soto, Marvin Araliga, Master Jinx, Matthew Rindle, Mean Machine D, Michael Hall, Mike Bruno, Noob, Paul Elliott, PlayStation's Better, Posty XL, Punky Dudester, RetroVision.com, Richard Stu Stewart, Rick67, Ron Studd, Sarah Powell, Sarai H. Al Sarai, Stephen Lewis, Time Lord Soundwave, Tom Elliott, Flaming Renee, Wazza Jugs, Zai. Yeah.